They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, it took Ukraine more than 3.5 years, but it just dished out some much-deserved vengeance to one of the so-called butchers of Bucha. Veniamin Mazzherin, a ruthless, cold-hearted war criminal linked to one of the worst atrocities in modern history. In a carefully planned and perfectly executed strike deep inside Russia, Ukrainian forces brought a sharp, sudden end to Mazzherin's life, and it still has a long list of other evil war criminals to find and eliminate in the weeks and months to come. The assassination took place in Russia's Kemerovo region, which is nestled in the central part of the nation in southern Siberia, with Kazakhstan to the southwest and Mongolia to the southeast. Kemerovo is around 2,000 miles away from the Ukrainian border, which makes this incident all the more impressive from Ukraine's point of view, as Kyiv proved yet again that its forces are more than capable of carrying out precise, targeted attacks, not just in its own occupied lands and border regions of Russia, but deep into enemy territory. On October 25th, a car was driving somewhere in this distant region of Russia. At the wheel was the war criminal Veniamin Mazzherin. We don't know where he was going or what he planned to do that day, yet when he awoke that Saturday morning, he never could have imagined it would be the last day of his life. But that's exactly what it turned out to be. According to an official report from the Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, Mazzherin's car was blown up that very day, killing the 45-year-old lieutenant colonel in an instant. The GUR posted a lengthy breakdown of the incident on its Telegram channel, alongside a video which explains Mazzherin's role in the horrific Bucha massacre, which took place in early 2022, shortly after the Russian invasion began. The video also allegedly shows the moment of Mazzherin's demise, as he is first caught on camera behind the wheel of a silver car. We then see an unidentified person standing at the side of the road and holding a remote detonator, before the camera pans to what seems to be that same silver car in the distance. Button is pushed, and the car blows up in a big burst of flames, and with that, Veniamin Mazzherin was no more. Here's what the GUR had to say about the event. On October 25, 2025, a car exploded in the Kemerovo region of the aggressor state of the Russian Federation, driven by war criminal Mazzherin Veniamin Vladimirovich. Police Lieutenant Colonel Mazzherin, born in 1980, served in the special unit of the OMON, Obereg, of the Russian Guard Directorate of the Kemerovo region. Obereg is one of the many units of the Russian Guard involved in war crimes and genocide of the Ukrainian people in the Kyiv region, committed by the occupation army during the full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation into the territory of Ukraine in February-March 2022. Based on the collected evidence and eyewitness accounts of the events, the Prosecutor General's office opened criminal investigations against the unit's servicemen, in particular for violation of the laws and customs of war. Back in April 2022, the military intelligence of Ukraine identified the war criminals from the Obereg by name and planned measures aimed at the fair punishment of those on the list. The Military Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reminds that there will be fair retribution for every war crime committed against the Ukrainian people. As the GUR report notes, Mazzherin was part of a special unit codenamed Obereg, which translates to amulet in English. That specific unit was being linked to war crimes committed in the Ukrainian city of Bucha back in March 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Kremlin forces crossed over the border from various regions and directions. Many entered Ukraine's eastern territories like Donetsk and Luhansk, which were believed to be Vladimir Putin's top targets at the time. However, some also entered Ukraine from the north via Belarus and marched towards the country's capital, Kyiv. A huge column of Russian military vehicles traversed the border and entered the Kyiv region, intent on proudly raising the Russian flag over Ukraine's heartland. But Kyiv is dozens of miles from the Belarus border, so Russia's forces first had to advance through various towns and cities on their journey to the capital. Bucha was one of those cities. Home to around 37,000 people before the war began, Bucha was a relatively small and sleepy city that very few people outside of Ukraine had ever even heard of. But by the end of April 2022, the entire world would know its name. On 27th of February 2022, Russian ground forces entered Bucha's city limits. There were tanks, paratroopers, military engineering units, and reserves from Russia's 36th Combined Arms Army. Special Rapid Response Unit (SOBR) and Special Purpose Mobile Unit (OMON) forces were also present, along with numerous artillery systems which bombarded the city, reducing several buildings to heaps of rubble. This was a serious force, and a small city like Bucha was not equipped to withstand it. It took the Russians less than 2 weeks to completely capture the city. There was still plenty of back-and-forth fighting in that time, with local Bucha residents playing their part and reportedly launching homemade Molotov cocktails at the invaders, setting several enemy vehicles ablaze in the process. Ukraine also managed to organize a partial evacuation of the city at the start of March, funneling hundreds of women and children out of the city by train and bus. and its ground forces did their utmost to fend off the invaders as long as possible. However, as the city came under increasingly intense shelling and Russian units seized control of all the area's major highways, the inevitable occurred, and Bucha fell under Kremlin control on March 12th. But Ukraine wasn't ready to simply give up on the city. In the days that followed, it made plans for a counter-offensive in the area, and by the end of the month, Bucha was back in Ukrainian hands and the Russians had retreated. For a brief instant, this appeared to be a significant win for Ukraine's forces. Unfortunately, in the days that followed, the full horror of what had happened in the city would slowly but surely be revealed, with millions of people across Ukraine and the wider world weeping at what they saw. There had already been hints that Russian forces in the city had most likely committed war crimes. During the initial Battle of Bucha, there were sporadic reports of Russian soldiers attacking civilian vehicles and opening fire on innocent residents, or trapping locals in their homes, only letting them out from time to cook food and move dead bodies. Indeed, on February 27th, the very first day of the battle, a local journalist reported that the Russian occupiers had opened fire on a civilian vehicle, killing one man and injuring another. On March 4th, another harrowing, heartbreaking story emerged. An SUV had been driving through the streets of Bucha. 3 young Ukrainians, all in their 20s, were on board. They had bravely decided to venture out into the city to deliver dog food to a local animal shelter that was running low on supplies, and they were on their way to a nearby family residence when suddenly, a Russian vehicle opened fire on the SUV, killing all 3 of its innocent, inoffensive occupants. The very next day, 2 panic-stricken families, frightened for their lives in the wake of near-constant Russian bombardment, decided to flee their hometown. They packed their bags and planned a westward route, out of Bucha towards the small village of Romanivka. In 2 separate cars, they hit the road, hoping to find a safe haven for themselves and their loved ones before the day was done. They barely made it to the end of the street. A Russian armored vehicle spotted the small convoy and immediately opened fire, killing a woman and her 2 sons in the first car and a man in the second. Several similarly horrific tales made headlines around the world as the battle raged on, but it was only when Ukraine's forces retook control of the city that the full extent of what has since become known as the Bucha massacre was unveiled. On April 1st, once Russians had withdrawn and Ukrainian troops began to assess the damage, shocking video footage hit social media, showing astonishing numbers of civilian casualties. Mutilated bodies of men, women, and children had been buried in mass graves. There was evidence of beatings, torture, rape, and execution, with many victims found with their hands tied behind their backs. Numerous bodies had been burned or simply left to decay on the streets, with some even booby-trapped with explosives, as one last cruel ploy by the ruthless Russian troops before they fled the area. Surviving residents soon began to share their stories, painting a grisly, gruesome picture of what truly occurred in the city during its brief but devastating spell under Russian occupation. Many spoke of living in a state of constant terror, forced to hide out in their basements, relying on candles for light and warmth, and what little food and water they had stored away to keep them alive, praying and hoping that each night would not be their last and that the Russians would not find them. Locals also shared countless tales of extraordinary Russian cruelty and callous disregard for human life. They spoke of Russian snipers who would pick off civilians the moment they left their homes, armored vehicles that randomly fired at buildings across the town, soldiers refusing medical aid to injured civilians, and extrajudicial executions. Eyewitnesses also spoke of Russian soldiers going door to door, interrogating locals, ransacking their homes, and either stealing or destroying their most precious possessions. Others recounted how the enemy troops used innocent Bucha inhabitants as human shields in firefights with Ukrainian forces, and the horror stories just kept coming. There were reports of women and girls forcefully abducted, locked in basements and abused, with many subsequently becoming pregnant, as well as tales of sadistic torture and systematic killings. One resident interviewed by reporters echoed what many of his surviving neighbors had stated. It was a system. They were killing people systematically. I personally heard how one sniper was boasting that he offed 2 people he saw in apartment windows. There was no need. There was no military justification to kill. It was just torturing civilians. On other blocks, people were really tortured. They were found with their hands tied behind their backs and shot in the back of the head. Russia, of course, attempted to downplay and deny any allegations of war crimes or atrocities, but evidence doesn't lie, and there was an extraordinary amount of evidence of the massacre, confirmed not only by residents but reporters from around the world who visited Bucha and saw with their own eyes the bodies in the streets and the devastation across the city. Video footage also quite clearly showed several instances of Russian soldiers executing civilians and Russian armored vehicles opening fire on innocent people. This evidence, too, was analyzed and verified by independent sources and media outlets around the world. We may never know the true extent of the massacre, nor the total number of innocent civilians who were tortured and killed for no justifiable reason whatsoever. Initial reports estimated around 280 bodies had been found in mass graves. That figure later rose to 300, then over 400, before closing in on 500, as more and more evidence was uncovered and human remains were found. Across the wider Bucha region, several news outlets like the BBC stated that over 1,000 civilians had been slaughtered by Russians over the course of just a few weeks. It was one of the worst atrocities in recent memory, an incomprehensible mass murder that shocked the world and revealed in graphic detail the ugly extent of Russia's aggression. And in the wake of that terrible, heinous event, Ukraine's military leadership and intelligence experts vowed to take revenge. They immediately got to work identifying all those involved in the massacre, finding out names, ages, locations, ranks, and more. It didn't take long for the GUR to start building a hit list of enemy officers, focusing on those in the Obereg special unit, which is believed to have been primarily responsible for what Ukraine's intelligence agency calls the genocide of the Ukrainian people in the Kyiv region. The list, which was published online on April 14, 2022, is made up of more than 60 individuals, all identified by name, rank, and even passport details. Veniamin Mazzherin was the fourth name on that list. He played his part in the massacre, and while we cannot know exactly what war crimes he may have committed, the GUR clearly found proof that he was involved. Naturally, Ukraine's forces weren't able to exact their revenge right away. They had countless other priorities, and tracking down a single, specific Russian officer is almost an impossible challenge, demanding huge amounts of effort, analysis, and intelligence. But the GUR never forgot their promise that it made to those who lost their lives in Bucha. It always intended to bring criminals like Mazzherin to justice, and when the opportunity presented itself, Ukraine's agents didn't hesitate. They located the lieutenant colonel in the Kemerovo region, initiated a surveillance operation to understand his habits and movements, and planned his demise. From there, it appears that Ukrainian agents must have somehow covertly planted an explosive device on Mazzherin's car, waiting until he was behind the wheel to push the button and end his existence at last. And this is not an isolated incident. In fact, there's been a whole series of assassinations of Russian officials and military figures inside their own territory in recent times. Back in April, for example, a Russian general and deputy head of the main operations directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Yaroslav Moskalik, was killed in a car explosion just outside Moscow. Unlike Mazzherin, Moskalik wasn't actually said to be behind the wheel at the time. Instead, he just stepped out of a building when a car containing an improvised explosive device detonated nearby, ending his life in an instant. Russia reportedly arrested the man responsible, claiming he was a Ukrainian special services agent and charging him with terrorism. And while Ukraine never actually claimed responsibility for this incident, there's certainly a strong likelihood that its agents were involved in some way or another. A few months prior to that incident, another Russian general, Igor Kirillov, was also killed by a remotely detonated bomb that had been planted in an electric scooter parked outside an apartment building in Moscow. Like Mazzherin, Kirillov was not a man of kind or noble character. He headed up Russia's nuclear, biological, and chemical protection forces and was believed to have authorized the use of illegal chemical weapons against Ukraine. More precisely, according to a report from the US Department of State, Kirillov signed off on the use of chloropicrin, a choking agent that was widely used during World War I and was banned in 1993 under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Ukrainian sources say that over 2,000 of their troops were hospitalized and 3 were killed as a direct result of chemical weapons attacks under Kirillov's command. Once again, Ukrainian forces bided their time, planned their actions with care, and struck when the time was right. The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, quickly claimed responsibility for the general's death, with one source telling The Economist that Kirillov was a war criminal and a perfectly legitimate target, before going on to issue a stern warning to others like him. Such a disgraceful end waits all those who kill Ukrainians. Another high-profile assassination occurred in late 2023 when the Kremlin-installed Luhansk lawmaker Mikhail Filiponenko was also killed by a car bomb. Again, Ukraine claimed responsibility, with the GUR taking to Telegram to announce the politician's death. A special operation to eliminate the executioner Filiponenko was implemented together with representatives of the resistance movement. The GUR went on to explain that Filiponenko had been involved in the organization of torture chambers in the occupied territories of the Luhansk region, where prisoners of war and civilian hostages were subjected to inhuman torture. There's a clear trend here. Russian officers and officials who torture, murder, poison, or otherwise bring harm to innocent Ukrainian people are being systematically hunted down and wiped off the map. Mazzherin is just the latest example. There are many more names on the GUR's list, and those that are still standing should be very worried for their future safety. Because, as Mazzherin's assassination proves, Ukraine's agents know no bounds. Even if Russian killers and criminals flee thousands of miles to hide, taking shelter in regions that seem safe and far from the horrors of war, Kyiv's forces are clearly capable of tracking them down and delivering swift justice. One by one, they will be located and they will be killed, and it seems that nothing will get in the way of the GUR's quest to eliminate every last one and take revenge for the hundreds of innocent men, women and children who lost their lives in such awful circumstances in Bucha back in 2022. Killing those responsible won't bring those poor civilians back, but it will, perhaps, help their surviving friends and family sleep a little more soundly. Learn more about the current state of play in the Russia-Ukraine war in this video, which looks at how Kyiv's precision strikes on oil refineries and infrastructure across Russia's regions have triggered an unstoppable crisis the Kremlin may never recover from. Or check out our detailed breakdown of irrefutable evidence that shows how the tide of the conflict is turning in Ukraine's favor, perhaps paving the way for Kyiv's forces to take back every single inch of land lost so far. To ensure you don't miss more breaking news and major developments from the Russia-Ukraine war and other global conflicts, make sure to click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. And thank you, as always, for watching.